Wow, it is so good to be here. I've known of your church for so many years, and I just want to thank you as a Southern Baptist IMB missionary for your support through the years. 25 years ago this fall, our family went to the former Soviet Union in Ukraine, and I'll share a little bit more about that with you as we go. The Lord has just been so good to us as we have followed the Lord and obeyed Him. And we just want to talk about what it means to follow Him and what it means for all of us. Now, I just want to put you at ease, okay? Because I found out a few years ago that people are kind of nervous when they have a missionary preacher. They just don't quite know what to do with him. And we had been for our first 4 years in Ukraine, and we went to a church in Texas. It was a church like this. It was really alive, had just a lot of good things going on, and some friends of ours were members there, and they'd invited us, and we came to that church, and we got there just before the service started. We had 3 teenage boys, and we sat on the far side over there about halfway back, and our name was in the bulletin. It was on the sign out front. Supposedly people knew we were coming or whatever, and they got to the welcome visitor time, and everybody was welcoming each other, hugging, talking to each other, and nobody said anything to us at all. So once the choir had finished the welcome song and everybody had taken their places and everything, but it was still just kind of a little bit going on, I tapped the lady in front of me on the shoulder and I said, "Good morning. We're the Stockwells. We're the missionaries." She leaned back, turned around, leaned back, looked at me and said, "Well, you look normal to me." So I just want you to know I'm bona fide, certified, normal. You don't have to be nervous. It's going to be okay. Why would somebody take off 25 years ago and go to the broken down, rusted, fallen apart Soviet Union? I'll tell you why, because God called us. We were in the suburbs of Houston. I'd been there 8 years at a wonderful church and loved it. I was in youth ministry. You'll figure that out as we go along, and just had a great time serving the Lord in our church. And now a lot of our young people are out serving the Lord and planting churches and everything else. And God just called us, and that's the only thing that could rip me apart from what I love doing and from our church was God's calling. So how does that work, and what does that mean for each one of us? Because when you walked in today, you were given a card that says, "What's your next assignment?" And see, here's what you need to know. Statistically, a typical church, only about 20% of the people do all the work. And the rest of the people wait to see what those 20% are going to do. Now, I know this is a good church, and so you're doing better than the average statistic. But some of you kind of sitting around and looking and going, "Well, I don't know about that." We're going to talk about that a little bit today, because I want to talk to you about the adventure of serving the Lord and just how much fun it is, and how God can just infuse us and the power that He gives us. To do that, I want us to begin by looking at Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 and 19. And this is the key verses that I have for us today. It says, "And I tell you, you're Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Now, I know we're all good Baptists, and we don't own this verse. The Catholics do, right? Because they got Peter and the secession, and he got the statue with the keys and everything. But actually, this is our verse too, because we actually know, and your pastor's a good theologian, and he's explained to you that when Jesus gave the keys to the kingdom, He wasn't saying that Peter is the rock. That's a play on words, that Peter, the little rock, and He points to Himself and He says, "But upon this rock, Jesus, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." But we have some interesting things going on as we look at Jesus building His kingdom and as He builds His church around the world. I heard a statistic about 10 years ago that just blew my mind. It's real simple. 86% of the world's Muslims, Hindi, and Buddhists have never had a conversation with an evangelical Christian. So how are they going to hear if they've never heard about Jesus, if they've never had conversation? I like to test out statistics and see if they're really true. Last month, I had a flight delay, a 24-hour flight delay in Detroit. So a guy named Muhammad was my taxi driver, and he had to drive me 25 miles across Detroit at 2 o'clock in the morning for me to get a hotel room. And I said, I need to ask you a question. I quoted a statistic because he was from Iraq and he's a Muslim. I said, has anybody in these 25 years that you've been driving a taxi here in Detroit, has anybody ever talked to you about their relationship with Jesus Christ and what Christians believe? We had already had some conversation so that he and I were already conversing. You know what I'm saying? That wasn't the first thing out of my mouth, in case you're wondering. And he thought, and he said, I don't guess they ever have. So I shared some things about the gospel. He said, wow, I've never heard that. And when we got to the hotel and we talked about some things, he handed me a card and he said, I'm driving tomorrow, and if you can, please call me. I'd like to talk with you some more. I'm just telling you something, folks. A lot of times we don't ever go there. We're afraid to go there because we're afraid of what we think they are. But 86% of them, even those living in America, nobody's ever just started the conversation. So let's go back. Let me give you a little bit of my testimony. Why would we go to the Soviet Union? I got to tell you this. I'm kind of old. I'm getting used to being old. I grew up in the times of the Soviet Union. I grew up when there was the thing of the Cold War, when we were afraid of nuclear holocaust. I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is nothing but chemical plants, oil refineries, big tanks full of oil and everything. And we knew that if there was ever all-out nuclear annihilation, that we were one of the first places that the missiles were coming. I thank God that I learned as a child, in case that was going to happen right there in school. They showed us films and everything else. And I knew that if all of a sudden they sent those missiles, and then if we saw that bright flash of light in the mushroom cloud and that wind and storm that just destroyed everything, all I had to do was hide under my little wooden desk. And I'd be safe and sound, and I'd climb up on the glowing rubble, and everything would be okay. That's a plan right there, buddy. I thank God for that. But I grew up in the times of the Soviet Union and watching the Olympics. And it was always the United States against the Russians. You remember? And they had the big burly Russian athletes and the bigger burlier Russian women athletes, Man, and one of the two of us was going to win. 1980, hockey, the miracle on ice. They even made a movie about it. Man, I got hoarse jumping up and down and screaming and because it was just such a part of our lives. But as a teenager, my mom brought home a couple of books, and I didn't typically read a lot. I was more into sports and everything like that. And Mom brought these books home, and I just read them. One's called God's Smuggler, Brother Andrew, and another one's called Tortured for His Faith. And then also, as growing up in church, we had two old guys who came and preached at our church and gave testimonies. And they were Russian, and they spoke with accent, and they preached gospel to us and told us what it's like in the former Soviet Union. And I just couldn't hate them. When I watched the Russians in the Olympics, for some reason, I couldn't hate them. I prayed for them because I read about that they couldn't have Bibles. They couldn't go to church. They couldn't share the gospel. That people were sent off to concentration camps and people were killed for the faith by the millions. And I prayed for them and I cared for them. And then all of a sudden, you remember in the 80s what happened? Ronald Reagan stood at that Berlin Wall and he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear that wall down. And we thought it could never happen. We thought, how stupid must he be? Billy Graham went over there and said, there's religious freedom in the Soviet Union. We're like, no way, there can't be. That's communism. We're coming to the end of the world and all the second coming and all that. And you know what happened? God did the greatest miracle in missions ever. All of a sudden, 40 countries and 400 million people, the wall fell and we rushed in like a mighty wind and we began to share the gospel and give out Bibles. 1990, I got to go on one of the first mission trips that Southern Baptists ever went on and went through Moscow and went through Red Square and we were there and I waited for an hour in line and they had to change in the guard with the Soviet soldiers and everything. And we went into Lenin's mausoleum and he's laying there in state and everybody's dead silent and all these Russian soldiers with their Kalashnikovs and everything. And I walked past them and boy, they're serious and they're looking and everybody's got to be quiet. Absolutely no noise. I walked by and Lenin's laying there and I leaned over, got as close as I could, said, hey buddy, you're dead. Jesus isn't, and I'm here to share the gospel and pass out Bibles and plant churches and there's not a thing you can do about it. You know what he said to me? Nothing. You know why? Because he's dead. And Jesus said, and we have the gospel, and it's alive, and it's powerful, and it's just so much fun. We got the call, and the open opportunity for us was to go to Kiev. I got this tall, beautiful Texas wife with big hair and the whole deal, and 3 little blonde-headed boys. God called us to Kiev, and everybody's like, well, Mick, you can go, but what about releasing those boys? Because it's just 70 miles from Chernobyl, the world's worst ever nuclear accident. You know, and I just happen to be an optimist, and I said, well, it's good and bad and everything, but, you know, you take your boys over there and they play around that dirt, a little bit of radiation and stuff. I said, well, good thing is they'll be easy to find in the dark. And I want you to know we've gotten nothing but glowing reports about those kids ever since. So God's just blessed us. I mean, He's just blessed us in incredible ways. I want to talk to you about this. What is it when there's something scary like that, like for us to go to the former Soviet Union and to live around nuclear fallout and everything? What is it? Why would we follow Him? Why would we do that? Why would we obey God and jump out and do something like that? I want to take you through this chapter, and I see this chapter as a walking sermon. Jesus is taking His disciples through, and there's some poignant moments here where He's teaching them because He really wants to lay it on them and tell them, look, I'm building my church. The victory's already won. The gates of hell itself can't stop this. And He's getting ready to hand it to them and say, you go do it. It wasn't about them watching Him do it. It's not about you watching Pastor Tom and watching the staff do it or watching a few small group leaders. He's talking to these guys. And remember, as we talk about these disciples, they weren't rocket scientists. They didn't have PhDs. They weren't brain surgeons. They were fishermen and tax collectors. They were regular people, just like you and just like me. And He's preparing them. And so this is how He prepares them. So let's look at this chapter. Let's begin with verse 1. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees came, and they wanted to test Him. And Jesus had just done a miracle where He just fed thousands of people on a hillside. And they asked Him to show them a sign from heaven. Well, they knew about all the miracles that He'd done. And He answered to them. He said, when it's evening, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it'll be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. And Jesus said, why would you ask me for a miracle? You know everything that's going on. The problem is that you aren't ready for the kingdom of heaven. You aren't ready to obey it. You aren't ready to lay it down. You aren't ready to trust me. You want to challenge me. And He said, the first thing you need a kingdom vision. You need foresight. You need vision to see and understand the world around you. You know, one of the base level that all of us are supposed to do is share our faith. That doesn't mean you have the gift of evangelism. Very few people do. But we all have the responsibility to share our faith when God gives us opportunity. Somebody say, well, He never gives me opportunity. Yeah, He does. I'm going to tell you this. In my role with the IMB, I have to travel a lot. And every time I go to get on an airplane, somebody asks me to witness to them. When I go to hand in my baggage, they say, sir, what is your final destination? Right? Heaven. Would you like to know about it? You know, I've literally had people say, yeah, I would. I've had people ask me in the airport, sitting there. They always say, what's your final destination? And I go, hey. And I've literally gotten the chance to witness. You know what? It's not always about that. But right here at home, I know this. I want you to know something, okay? I know that it's more difficult with your own neighbors, your own relatives, at holidays or at school, around the locker, around the lunch table, or whatever you do. That's the hardest place to witness because people know you and you know they're going to be watching you. And for me, I have to tell you, to go to Ukraine when we went, when it was a wide open mission field, and plus what? I get paid to do that, right? And I'm in it for the money. That's why I'm a missionary, right? I know it's difficult, but I want to tell you something. The greatest gift you need, and what you need from the Lord, is ears to listen to what people say. Because people give you opportunity all the time. How they do that? Usually when they're complaining, or they have trouble with their kids, or somebody's sick, or they're having some kind of problem in life. Immediately you can say, you know, I don't have all the answers. You know me. But I want you to know, man, I find peace and I find help. I pray the Lord, and also my church community, just like the pastor just talked about, my church community helps look after me. And you lay that out there and you wait to see if they respond. If they respond, you go further. If they don't, you just bless them and you ask them, can I pray for you? I asked to get the Muslim guy in his car, can I pray for you before I get out? And he said, would you? Would you pray for me? And I prayed for him. Now, he didn't get saved right then. I don't know what's going to happen with his journey, but you see, I took what little bit he would give, and I gave him the Word of God and put a thought in his heart. I told him, I said, the God, the creator of this universe, loves you, and He loves your kids, and He loves your family. And I prayed for him. So for us, when the Soviet Union opened up, when Mr. Gorbachev let that wall down, and when people flooded through that Iron Curtain, I just knew that God had called us and called our family, and He just worked it out in such wonderful ways. And I want you to know, there was a song back then called The Great Adventure. And for 25 years, we've lived an incredible adventure, witnessing to our neighbors, sharing the gospel, planting churches, training leaders, and now sending people from the broken down, rusted Soviet Union to places in the world where you and I can't go. I can't even say it out loud today. Places where Russians and Ukrainians are going on mission trips, because I don't want their governments to know that that's why those people are there. So the first thing is the foresight. That's the vision to see the world around us in God's eyes and see what opportunities He gives us. The second one, let's look and start with verse 5. When the disciples had reached the other side, see, Jesus told them, get in the boat. I just want to tell you, the only time I get nervous around Jesus is when He tells me to get in a boat. Because the disciples, He was always, bringing a storm up or something like that and having to calm a storm or walk on the waters. I sink pretty badly. I don't mind getting on a plane. I'm just nervous about boats. And the disciples had reached the other side, but they had forgotten to bring any bread. And Jesus said to them, watch and beware, because He was always using life to explain the gospel and explain His will to them. Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. Now, I just want to say right here is proof that the disciples were Baptists. Because everywhere they went, they had to have a fellowship dinner, right? We Baptists are about that. I grew up as a Southern Baptist all my life, and I grew up during the days of youth choir in the 70s. Anybody remember youth choirs? Anybody ever? Oh, man, youth choirs, they were something. Our church ran 400 on Sunday, and we had an average of 113 in youth choir on Sunday night. I mean, it was big, and we were good. And we went on youth choir trips and everything else. Part of that always meant that we had to eat after choir practice. And sometimes we went to people's homes. Sometimes we just had it there at church. But that was back in the day. You didn't have a church hostess. You didn't have a church kitchen. Moms had to prepare it. And so they called around, they had a list. They called around and they'd ask Mom, would you send a loaf of sandwich? Would you send some chips? Would you send some cookies? And so we would just put it all together and make a fellowship. Well, I don't know why. It was a beautiful spring day. And they sent us to Leah Valet's house. She only lived about a half a mile from the church. We're out in the backyard and patio, trees and all that. It was a wonderful day. And they had some sandwiches. Well, youth usually eat like tuna fish, ham and cheese, peanut butter, We ate everything, but some mom had sent pimento cheese. 7th and 8th graders do not know what pimento cheese is. They do not eat it. We don't know what pimento is, and it scares us. Here it was beautifully laid out, Home and Gardens. They had cut off the edges, cut them like that. There's these beautiful triangles, and we're staring at them, and nobody ate a one, and everything else was gone. So we're looking at them, and looking at each other like, not going to eat that. And they had this big St. Bernard dog. So one of us, who, tends to be like this, said, I wonder if the dog will eat it. And so handed the dog one, and he liked it. Okay. So before long, we started tossing him in the air, and the dog was running across the patio, catching it in the air. Oh, and he'd eat it, and he'd get on the other side of that patio, and he'd flip around, just like, come back, flying in the air, throw another one. Before long, he ate that whole loaf of pimento cheese. 2 days later, they found him dead in the bushes. Pimento cheese will kill you. So the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread. But Jesus looked at him and listen to what he said. This is a stinger right here. This is the kind of thing that hurts. And you never want to hear these words from Jesus. He said, "Oh, you of little faith. Why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Don't you perceive? In other words, don't you get it?" Man, you don't want to hear those words. Don't you get it? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many extra baskets, how many leftovers you gathered? Or the 7 loaves or the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it you fail to understand? I don't speak about bread. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they understood. He didn't tell them to beware of the yeast in the bread, but to beware of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, what was so bad about the Pharisees and Sadducees? Remember, they were religious teachers. They could have taught at any seminary. They had the first 5 books. Many of them had the first 5 books memorized. You ever read Numbers and Leviticus? And somebody, my goodness, why would you memorize that? They had those things memorized. They lived by them. And you know what? Not only that, they made extra rules that even God himself didn't ask them to do. You know, they were a lot like legalists. I don't know if you've ever run into legalism, and that's what Jesus is telling them to be afraid of. First of all, be afraid of people. I just got onto them who have no kingdom vision. They don't recognize God when he walks in front of them. When God walks up and does a miracle, clearly calls you, shows you what's going on in the world, and you don't see it. That's why Jesus said, don't you perceive? Don't you get it? Don't you see it? Don't you sense it? No kingdom vision. Second thing is legalism. Legalism is a system, and I've been around a lot of that, and we had that, frankly, in a lot of the Soviet Union. That is where you make rules and you keep up with everybody and you got everything in order, but you don't get anything done out there in the world. You do it all right there where you are. Why? Because you're afraid. You're afraid somebody's going to go off and do something. You're negative. And the worst thing about legalism is it paralyzes you. It paralyzes you. It makes you afraid to step out in faith and do something because you're afraid of what everybody else is going to say. Listen, they had rituals and traditions that trumped true religion. They had all kinds of rituals, traditions. They gave their tithe. They prayed long prayers. They had all these nice white robes, and they did all of that. But they didn't have a heart for God. They didn't know God when he walked up on them. And here's the other one. They got their reward on earth. That is not where our reward is. So, Jesus got on to them for not having faith. Don't be like the Pharisees and Sadducees where you got this religious system, but it doesn't take any faith to get through it. You just follow the rules, keep your nose clean, and do what's right. Show up at church, pay your money, go home, and you don't ever step out in faith. You don't want to live that way, I'm telling you. Because faith is the fuel for this adventure. It's the fuel. Man, it's incredible to step out in faith. But he did something. He took a little bit of a different turn here. Look at verse 13. Now, when Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, and you know this question, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. In other words, he's a good teacher. We hear that from every other religion around the world. Yeah, he's a good teacher. He was a prophet. We just put him in there with everybody else. That's what everybody else says. That's what the rest of the world says. And he said, but who? Who do you say? Who do you say? Who do you say that I am? And my favorite one, Peter said, you're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. You're the Christ. You're it. You're all of it. You're God. In other places, you know, it's a time when everybody else left and quit following Jesus, and Jesus said, will you turn away too? And Peter says, where are we going to go? Who would we follow? We sang about that this morning, didn't we, Dave? Where are we going to go? Who we follow? Now, let me tell you this. Let me tell you why he asked this. Because when Jesus calls us out in faith, when He shows us a door, like when He showed us a former Soviet, yeah, I got enough sense to have been a little bit of afraid and to take my wife and my kids over there. Sure I did. I didn't know what life was going to be like. But too often, let me tell you what we do. We start counting the cost. And we start worrying and saying, do I have the education and the training? Do I have the talents, the abilities, the personal gifting? Do I know the strategy? And then what's the big one, Brother Tom? Do I have the money? Who's going to pay for this? You see, Jesus didn't ask them how smart they were or how educated they were. He didn't ask them about their talents, abilities, or the spiritual gifts, although I think it's good for us to know those things. We can use those for God's glory. He didn't ask them about a strategy. It was pretty obvious. You look in the book of Acts that Paul ended up with a strategy. He had one. He didn't ask them about finances. He asked one question. Who am I to you? And folks, if you're sitting there and you're not doing anything and you're not stepping out in faith, the biggest reason is because you have not in your life said, Jesus Christ is the Lord of my life. I accepted Him as my Savior and my Lord. And when I did, I gave Him everything, and I will follow Him to the ends of the earth, wherever He takes me. Who am I to you? And when He calls you, that's the main question. He's not asking you anything else. He's asking you, are you my sheep? And will you follow me? Will you be obedient? Will you trust me? That's what He's asking. Once He settled that, once Peter made that declaration, you're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God, you're God Himself, and we'll follow you anywhere. Where else would we go? The last one I want to share with you is the word forward. And that is unlocking your destiny with the keys to the kingdom. And I tell you, you're Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, on the rock of Jesus, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Wow. Keys to the kingdom. Let me ask you this. How many of you have ever gotten your own driver's license? Can I see your hand? You've experienced that? How many of you are parents and you've had a teenager in your home get their driver's license? Can I see your hand? This is a moment just like that. In the state of Texas, where my boys got their driver's license, when you're 16, you study a course on your own, and you go down there, and by the way, they don't even make you take a driver's test. You don't even physically get in a car and drive to prove that you can drive. Your parents just sign off for you. You know what they call that place where they give teenagers the right to drive on the freeways in Dallas and Fort Worth and Austin and San Antonio without ever having taken a driver test? They call that the Department of Public Safety. Who thought of that, right? So anyway, but you know the moment. Here's this kid, they're 16 years old, and all of a sudden you're thinking, my goodness, it was just a couple of years ago I was changing their diapers. We were playing t-ball, and the next thing you know, they're sitting there looking at you, and you take them to get their driver's license. If both of you took them or whatever, you come home and you're going to celebrate. Either mom's going to fix a dinner or you go out to eat or whatever, but before long, you're back home, and here comes that moment that you can't believe is happening. That 16-year-old walks up and looks you in the eye, and they stick their hand out and they say, Mom, Dad, can I have the keys? And why do they want those keys? Because they want to get in that car. They want to take that adventure. They're a little bit nervous. They really are. Their knees are probably shaking. But they see to them what is the most beautiful sight in their life, and that is Mom and Dad are standing at the end of the driveway hugging each other and crying, and that teenager sees that view in the rear view mirror as they drive off. But that's a moment of freedom. It's a moment of adventure. It's something they've waited for all their lives when they ask, Mom, Dad, can I have the keys? And folks, it's a moment just like that. Jesus is standing there and He's looking at us and He goes, I give you the keys to the kingdom. I give you the keys. But you know what? He's holding the keys out. It's not us asking for the keys. He's holding the keys. And He says, do you want them? And we have to reach out in faith and take those keys and trusting on Him and trusting on the foundation that He's the Christ. He's the Son of the living God. To close, I want to share with you a testimony of our family. I'd been in a great youth ministry. The Lord just blessed us. We had great youth workers. We grew just tremendously. And man, it was just so much fun. And my boys grew up with that. And our oldest boy was 11 when we got ready to go to the field. So he was looking forward all his life. It's all he ever knew was being in Dad's youth ministry. Just before we got ready to leave, he and his mom were in the church parking lot. We had a little Astro minivan, and they were driving home. And Christopher looks at his mom. He said, Mom, we're just going to do this for a few years, and we're going to come back here to Houston Northwest, and Dad's going to be my youth minister. I'm going to grow up in the youth ministry here, right? And she said, no, Christopher, we plan on doing this for life. And he just burst into tears. I mean, just heaving, crying. She just stopped the little minivan right there and put it in park. Reached over and said, Son, I know why you feel that way. But we're going there. And this is a great adventure. We're going to trust God to give you a youth ministry. And let's pray about that right now. He said, okay, Mom. And they prayed and they wiped the tears away and they drove off. We got to Ukraine, and man, there was no youth ministry going on. And in the city where we grew up, we had built this ministry center, and we had some volunteers come, and they didn't know it, but we passed out flyers, and 22 teenagers showed up for Vacation Bible School with a volunteer team. None of them worked with youth, and my son was 17 years old. And they said, what are we going to do? And my son said, I tell you what, I know what to do. If you just give me a couple of workers. And that week, 22 young people came to Christ. He started a discipleship ministry, and within a year and a half, they were having events with as many as 200 young people. He started youth ministry that is now planted a church. He helped plant that church, and several international churches have been planted since then. But I want to tell you when the moment came that really changed his heart, that really spoke to him. We were at a place called Glorieta, New Mexico. It's like Ridgecrest. I don't know if you've ever been to either one of those. And all the teenagers were there. There's a bunch of missionary kids there, and they sent them out one day as one of their activities to go out in the desert of New Mexico and pass out Vacation Bible School flyers for a church plant. And my son and another little girl from our part of the world prayed and asked God, show us somebody to witness to today. We want to share our faith. About the fourth house they got to, they knocked on the door. And a lady answered the door. She was an elderly lady. And he started talking, and she said, no English. He said, what do you speak? And she said, Russian. And he said, Добрый день, меня зовут Christopher, американец настоящий, но говорю по-русски, потому что я живу на Украине. Можно с вами ближе познакомиться? Right? Isn't that what you'd say? She threw her door open, and those two teenagers shared with her. She actually had a Bible on her shelf like an icon. She had never read it. And they shared the gospel for the first time in her life. She had never heard the gospel. In America, in the desert in New Mexico. Two teenagers who spoke Russian. And he came back and said, Dad, for the first time in my life, I knew that I was the only person at that time in that place that God could use. And Dad, that's what I want in my life. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this wonderful church. And as our friends and people are sitting here praying about what is my next assignment, indeed, Lord, what is it? God, use your word. Lord, may they trust you. May they trust your calling. May they have vision. May they have faith. May they have the solid rock foundation of Jesus Christ as their Lord. And may they reach out with all joy and a sense of adventure and take the keys to the kingdom. Bless them. May they respond to you and your calling today. In Jesus' name, amen.